Welcome to the Boring Podcast. Tonight we'll calmly talk through something that happened, perhaps, or didn't. If this helps you drift off, we've done our job. Feel free to do nothing at all.
Yes, welcome. We're here, or rather, our voices are here, and we're going to discuss something. Something that exists in many places yet often goes unnoticed. Something you might see every day but rarely, if ever, truly consider. And that something, in its various forms and iterations, is wall paint. Or more specifically, the texture of wall paint. Not the color, not the smell, just the texture. The way it feels. Or doesn't feel. We'll delve into that. Slowly, gently, over the next, a while.
Wall paint. It's on walls. Most walls, anyway. Interior walls, exterior walls. Sometimes ceilings. Even floors, occasionally, although that's less common, but we're focusing on walls. Walls with paint. And the texture of that paint. Because paint isn't just a color, it's a feeling. A tactile sensation. Or the lack thereof. Sometimes it's smooth. Sometimes less so. And we'll talk about that. The smoothness, the roughness, the in-betweenness. All of it. In detail. Excruciating detail.
Now, when we say texture, we're talking about the surface of the paint, the way it feels to the touch, or perhaps more accurately, the way you imagine it would feel to the touch. Because, let's be honest, how often do you actually touch your walls? Probably not very often. But you can still imagine it. The coolness of the wall, the slight give, the subtle texture. And that's what we're here to discuss, the imagined tactile sensation of wall paint. It's a fascinating topic, in its own uneventful way. We'll unpack it, bit by bit, layer by layer, just like, not exactly like paint, but slowly, very slowly.
Smooth. Rough. Somewhere in between. These are the broad categories of wall paint texture. Of course, within those categories, there are nuances. Subtle variations, almost imperceptible differences. And we'll explore those too. Because that's what we do here. We explore the mundane. We dissect the ordinary. We analyze the wall paint. Its texture. Because even the most mundane things deserve our attention. Or perhaps, our lack of attention. If you're falling asleep, that's perfectly fine. That's the goal, really.
Think about a smooth wall. Imagine running your hand across it. The slight coolness, the almost imperceptible resistance, the lack of bumps or ridges, just smooth, uniform, unremarkable. And yet, in its unremarkableness, there is something remarkable. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it's just smooth. And that's okay. We can talk about smooth with a may-up. We have plenty of time. We're not going anywhere. Neither are you, hopefully. Just relax and let the smoothness wash over you.
Now, on the other hand, consider a textured wall. One with a texture. Perhaps it's slightly rough. A little bumpy. Maybe it has a pattern. A subtle stippling. Or a more pronounced something. Whatever it is, it's not smooth, it's textured. And that texture, however subtle, adds a dimension. A layer of something. To the wall, to the room, to the experience. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it just makes the wall textured. And that's okay too. We can talk about that.
So as you can see, the texture of wall paint is a complex and multifaceted topic. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just paint. On a wall. But even in its simplicity, there's a certain something. A certain je ne sais quoi. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just paint. And that's fine, we're here to talk about it. Or rather, to gently murmur about it. To whisper its secrets into the silence, the quiet of the night. Or day. Whenever you're listening, it doesn't really matter. Time is relative. Especially when discussing wall paint texture.
So as we're saying, wall paint, it has a texture. Sometimes it's smooth, sometimes it's not so smooth. You might run your hand across a wall and think, ooh, that's a bit rough. Or perhaps, that's quite smooth. And that's the texture we're talking about, the feeling of it under your fingertips, or maybe the back of your hand if you prefer. It's a subtle thing, this texture, not like the texture of Say, a corrugated cardboard box, which is very obviously textured. Wall paint is more subtle. You have to pay attention to really notice it. And even then, it might not be very noticeable. It depends on the paint, you see. And the wall. Some walls are smoother than others.
Yes, the wall itself can influence the final texture. A rough wall will make even the smoothest paint feel a bit rough, whereas a perfectly smooth wall, well, that's the ideal canvas for exploring the nuances of paint texture. Imagine running your hand across a newly plastered wall, perfectly smooth. Then imagine that same wall, painted with a slightly textured paint. The difference might be barely perceptible, but it's there. And that's what we're discussing here today. This subtle difference. It's quite fascinating when you think about it. Or perhaps not. It depends on your perspective, I suppose. Some people find this sort of thing interesting. Others, not so much. It's a matter of personal preference.
Indeed, personal preference plays a role. Some people prefer a smoother finish, while others might like a little texture. Think about the different types of paint. Matte, satin, gloss. Each has its own unique texture. Matte is usually quite flat, not very reflective. Satin has a bit of a sheen, a slight gloss. And gloss, well, that's very shiny and reflective, almost like a mirror. But even within these categories, there are variations. One brand of matte paint might be slightly smoother than another. These subtle differences can be quite subtle. They're not always obvious, but they are there. You just have to look, or rather feel, very closely.
Feeling is key when it comes to paint texture. Close your eyes and imagine running your hand along a wall. Can you feel the slight bumps and ridges? Or is it perfectly smooth? Perhaps it's somewhere in between. The texture can also change depending on how the paint was applied. A roller will leave a different texture than a brush, and spraying will create yet another texture. It's a complex subject, this texture of wall paint. More complex than you might think. Or maybe less complex. Again, it depends on your perspective. One could spend hours discussing the nuances of paint texture. Or one could just not think about it at all. It's a matter of choice.
Choice is important. The choice of paint, the choice of application method, the choice of wall. All these choices contribute to the final texture. Imagine choosing a paint color. You might go to a store and look at paint chips. Small squares of cardboard painted with different colors. You hold them up to the wall, trying to imagine what the color will look like, covering the entire surface. But you also need to consider the texture. Will it be smooth? Rough? Somewhere in between? These are important considerations. They might not seem important, but they are. At least, to some people. To others, they might not be important at all, and that's perfectly fine. It's a matter of personal preference. As we said before.
We did say that before, yes. Personal preference. It's a key factor in many things, not just wall paint texture. But we are talking about wall paint texture today, so let's focus on that. Imagine a wall painted with a very textured paint. Perhaps a textured paint designed to mimic the look of stucco. That would be a very different texture than a smooth, matte paint. You could run your hand along the wall and feel the bumps and ridges, the texture. It would be quite noticeable. Much more noticeable than the subtle texture of a smooth paint. It's all about the details, the nuances. Or perhaps it's not. Perhaps it's just paint on a wall.
Paint on a wall. That's a simple way of putting it. But it's also quite accurate. At the end of the day, that's what it is. Paint. On a wall. But there's so much more to it than that. The color, the texture, the sheen. These are all important factors. They contribute to the overall look and feel of the room. A smooth, matte paint will create a different atmosphere than a rough, textured paint. It's subtle, but it's there. This subtle difference. It's something you might not even notice consciously, but it affects your perception of the space. It can make a room feel cozy or cold, inviting or austere.
And let's not forget the way light interacts with the paint. A glossy paint will reflect light differently than a matte paint. This can create interesting effects, highlights, and shadows. The texture of the paint can also affect how light is reflected. A rough texture will scatter light more than a smooth texture. These are subtle details, but they can have a big impact on the overall appearance of the room. It's something to consider when choosing paint. Or maybe not. As we've said, it all comes down to personal preference. Some people pay attention to these details, others don't. And that's perfectly all right. There's no right or wrong way to appreciate, or not appreciate, the texture of wall paint.
Precisely. There's no right or wrong way. It's a matter of personal taste. Some people might prefer a smooth, uniform texture, while others might prefer something a little more textured. And that's perfectly acceptable. It's all about what you like, what makes you feel comfortable, what makes you feel sleepy, perhaps. If you're listening to this podcast, hopefully you're feeling very sleepy by now. The gentle, monotonous discussion of wall paint texture should be having a soothing effect, lulling you into a state of peaceful relaxation.
Relaxation, yes, that's the goal. To help you relax and drift off to sleep. We're not here to excite or entertain, just to calmly and quietly discuss the mundane details of everyday life. Like the texture of wall paint. It's not a particularly exciting topic, but that's the point. It's boring, intentionally boring. And that's what makes it so relaxing, hopefully. If it's not relaxing, well then we've failed. But hopefully it is. Hopefully you're feeling very drowsy right now. Your eyelids are getting heavy. Your breathing is slowing down. You're drifting off to sleep.
As we were saying, or rather, as I believe we were saying, the texture of wall paint can be quite well textured. It isn't always smooth, you see. Sometimes it's a little rough, sometimes it's a little bumpy. And sometimes, if you look closely, very, very closely, you might notice tiny little bumps, almost like grains of sand, but not quite. It depends on the type of paint, of course, and the way it was applied. A roller leaves a different texture than a brush, and a sprayer leaves a different texture again. It's all rather fascinating, in a very subtle way, like watching paint dry, almost. But we'll get to that later, perhaps. Or perhaps not.
Yes, the application method does indeed influence the final texture. A roller, with its fluffy cylindrical form, distributes the paint in a somewhat stippled pattern. Imagine a gentle rolling motion across the wall, leaving behind a slightly uneven surface. A brush, on the other hand, with its bristles, might create a more linear texture, with faint streaks or lines visible upon close inspection. And a sprayer, with its fine mist of paint, can result in a smoother, more uniform finish, although even then, tiny variations can occur. It's quite a fascinating process to consider, if you have the time and inclination to do so. Which, on this podcast, we assume you do. Or, at least, we hope you do.
Now, we talked earlier, or at least I think we did, about the different types of paint. There's flat paint and eggshell and satin and semi-gloss and high gloss. Each one has its own unique texture, or feel, if you will. Flat paint is, well, flat. It doesn't reflect much light, and it feels smooth. Not perfectly smooth, mind you, but relatively smooth. Eggshell has a little more sheen, a little more texture, and so on, up the scale, to high gloss, which is very shiny and can feel almost slippery. It's a subtle difference, but a difference nonetheless. And these differences can contribute to the overall ambience of a room. Or not. It depends.
The different sheens, as we've mentioned, contribute significantly to the perceived texture. Flat paint, with its minimal light reflection, can feel quite smooth to the touch, almost velvety in a way. Eggshell, with its slightly higher sheen, has a subtly different feel, a bit more textured perhaps. Satin and semi-gloss, with their increasing levels of glossiness, feel progressively smoother and more slick. And high gloss, with its maximum light reflectivity, can feel almost glassy, smooth, and hard. It's all a matter of personal preference, of course. What one person finds appealing, another might find less appealing.
So, to recap, or rather to reiterate, the texture of wall paint is influenced by several factors. The type of paint, the application method, the sheen, these all play a role in the final result. A wall painted with flat paint will have a different texture than a wall painted with high gloss paint. A wall painted with a roller will have a different texture than a wall painted with a brush. It's a complex interplay of factors, really. Or perhaps not so complex. It depends on how you look at it. And how much time you have to think about it. Which, again, we assume is quite a lot.
Indeed, as we've been discussing, these factors interact in subtle but perceptible ways. The type of paint, whether it's flat, eggshell, satin, semi-gloss, or high gloss, inherently possesses a certain base texture. The application method, whether it's a roller, a brush, or a sprayer, further modifies this texture, adding its own unique imprint. And finally, the interplay of light with the sheen of the paint creates the overall perceived texture. It's a fascinating process to contemplate, the way these elements combine to create the final result. A result that we often take for granted, perhaps, but one that is worth considering nonetheless.
And let's not forget the role of the wall itself. A smooth wall will provide a different canvas, so to speak, than a rough wall. The texture of the wall itself can influence the final texture of the paint. Imagine painting a rough, textured wall with a smooth, high-gloss paint. The roughness of the wall might show through, creating a rough and textured finish. Or, conversely, imagine painting a smooth wall with a textured paint. The texture of the paint would be more prominent, more noticeable. It's all very nuanced.
The underlying surface, as you rightly pointed out, is a crucial factor. A smooth wall provides a uniform base for the paint, allowing the paint's inherent texture to be more clearly expressed. A rough wall, on the other hand, introduces its own textural variations, which interact with the paint's texture, creating a more complex result. The interplay between the wall's surface and the paint's texture is a subtle but important aspect of the overall effect. And this effect, of course, contributes to the overall aesthetic of the room, even if we aren't consciously aware of it. Or perhaps especially if we aren't consciously aware of it.
It's a lot to think about, isn't it? All these factors contributing to the final texture of wall paint. The type of paint, the application method, the sheen, the underlying surface. It's enough to make one's head spin. Or not. Perhaps it's just me. In any case, it's something to consider the next time you're staring at a wall. Which, let's be honest, is probably quite often. Less than / person 1 greater than. Less than person 1 greater than. So we were discussing the texture of wall paint. And, sometimes, when you run your hand across a freshly painted wall, or not even freshly painted, it could be a wall painted a long time ago, maybe a week ago, maybe a month, maybe even a year, you might notice a slight texture. It's not always smooth, is it? Sometimes it's a bit bumpy. Or maybe not bumpy, but just not perfectly smooth. Like if you were to close your eyes and imagine perfectly smooth glass, and then imagine touching the wall. There's a difference. This reminds me of a time I tried to make perfectly smooth mashed potatoes, but there were always tiny lumps. Anyway, back to the wall. It's a subtle thing, this texture. You might not even notice it if you weren't specifically thinking about it.
Yes, that slight texture you mentioned. It's a fascinating thing to consider, really. The way the paint sits on the wall, sometimes it's almost like tiny, tiny mountains and valleys. Microscopic, really. You wouldn't see them with the naked eye. Not usually, anyway. Or maybe you would, depending on the light. And the type of paint, of course. Some paints are glossier, and some are more matte. And that affects the texture, too. It's like comparing a polished stone to a rough one. Or, a ripe peach to the skin of a nectarine. Subtle differences, but they're there. I once spent a whole afternoon comparing different types of apples at the grocery store. It was enlightening. So many varieties.
Right, the type of paint definitely makes a difference. And the way it's applied. A roller leaves a different texture than a brush. And then there are spray guns, which create a finer, more even coat. I remember once trying to paint a fence with a spray gun. It didn't go as planned. Most of the paint ended up on the grass. The grass was a bit shiny for a while. But, back to the wall. If you use a roller, you might get a slightly stippled effect, depending on the nap of the roller. There are short nap rollers, medium nap rollers, and long nap rollers. So many choices. It can be overwhelming, honestly.
It really can. Choosing the right roller is important. The nap of the roller determines how much paint it holds and how it distributes the paint on the wall. A thicker nap will hold more paint and create a more textured finish. A thinner nap will hold less paint and create a smoother finish. Like choosing the right socks for a walk. Too thick, and your feet get sweaty. Too thin, and you get blisters. The right sock is essential. Just like the right roller nap, it's all about finding the right balance. It's a delicate process. Choosing a paint color is another matter altogether.
Oh, choosing paint colors. That can take days, even weeks. So many shades of white, for instance. There's off-white, eggshell, cream, ivory, pearl. They all look slightly different depending on the lighting, too. Natural light versus artificial light. It's a whole thing, and then you have to consider the other colors in the room. The furniture, the curtains, the carpet. It's a lot to take in. I once spent a whole week just choosing a paint color for my bathroom. I ended up going with the same color it was before.
It's understandable. The pressure of choosing the right color, it can be daunting. I once painted a room bright orange thinking it would be cheerful. It wasn't. It was intense. I repainted it a week later. A much calmer shade of beige. Beige is a safe choice. It goes with everything. Or almost everything. Unless you have, like, bright purple furniture, that might clash. Though sometimes clashing can be interesting. Or maybe not. I once saw a bird with bright purple feathers. It was quite striking.
Purple birds. Orange walls. Beige walls. White walls. So many options. It's enough to make your head spin. Sometimes I just stare at a blank wall and try to imagine all the different colors it could be. And all the different textures. Smooth, rough, bumpy, stippled. The possibilities are endless. It's almost overwhelming. I think I need a nap.
A nap sounds good. Just closing your eyes and letting your mind wander. Thinking of nothing in particular. Or maybe thinking of something very simple, like the gentle rise and fall of your breath. Or the soft hum of the refrigerator. Or the subtle texture of the wall paint. Or furnace. Just drifting off into a peaceful slumber. So restful.
So we've talked a bit about the texture of wall paint. And I think it's worth circling back to some of those initial points just to really let them sink in, you know? We started by talking about the subtle differences between matte, satin, and eggshell finishes. Matte, as we discussed, has that very flat, non-reflective look. It's almost like looking at a piece of construction paper, in a way, but on a wall. Satin has a bit more of a sheen, a subtle gloss. Not too much, mind you. Just a hint of reflectivity. And eggshell, well, that sits somewhere in between, doesn't it? It's like if matte and satin had a baby. A very boring, texture-focused baby.
Yes, and we also touched on the way light interacts with these different textures. Remember how we talked about how light kind of just sits on a matte surface? It doesn't bounce around much, which contributes to that flat look. Then with satin, the light reflects a little more, giving it that slight sheen we mentioned earlier. It's a very subtle difference, but it's there if you look closely. Or even if you don't look closely, you might still perceive it subconsciously. With eggshell, the light reflection is somewhere in the middle. Not quite as flat as matte, but not as shiny as satin. It's a delicate balance, a nuanced interplay of light and texture. It's quite fascinating, in a very unexciting way.
We should probably mention the tactile aspect again too. Running your hand across a matte wall, it just feels flat. There's no real texture there, no bumps or ridges. It's smooth, in a non-stimulating way. Satin, on the other hand, has that subtle smoothness with just a hint of something. It's not quite rough, but not completely smooth either. It's somewhere in between, just like its light reflectivity. And eggshell, again, sits right in the middle. It's the Goldilocks of wall paint textures. Not too rough, not too smooth, just right. Or, perhaps, just there.
And let's not forget how these textures are achieved. We talked about the different ingredients in the paint that contribute to the final texture. Things like pigments, binders, and solvents, all playing their part in the grand yet understated scheme of wall paint texture. The ratios of these ingredients can affect the final outcome, leading to subtle variations within each finish category. It's a complex process, yet it results in something so seemingly simple. Or perhaps, not so simple after all? The more you think about it, the more complex it becomes. Or maybe not.
It's also worth reiterating the point about how the texture of the wall itself can influence the final appearance of the paint. A perfectly smooth wall will provide a different canvas than a textured wall, even with the same paint finish. This interaction between the wall and the paint is a key factor in achieving the desired look. It's a subtle interplay, yet one that can have a significant impact, a seemingly minor detail, but one that is worth considering. Or perhaps not. We've been talking about this for a while now.
We did indeed. And remember how we talked about how different brands might have slightly different formulations, even for the same finish? A matte finish from one brand might not be exactly the same as a matte finish from another. These subtle variations can add another layer of complexity to the already complex world of wall paint textures. It's a lot to consider. Or maybe not. Maybe we're overthinking it. Perhaps. But maybe not. Thinking about this makes me sleepy.
Thinking about these subtle differences, and the way they interact with light and the wall surface itself, it really is quite something. Or perhaps it isn't. Maybe we're making a big deal out of nothing. But maybe we're not. It's hard to say, really. Perhaps we should move on to something else. Or perhaps not. It's all so very textural.
Indeed. And we should remember the practical implications of choosing the right texture. Matte finishes are good at hiding imperfections, but they're not as durable. And more durable, but shows imperfections more readily. Eggshell, as always, falls somewhere in between. The choice depends on the specific needs of the room and the desired aesthetic. A practical consideration wrapped up in a textural package. A package that we've now thoroughly unwrapped and examined from all angles. Perhaps too thoroughly.
So we were talking about the texture of wall paint. And, sometimes it's not entirely smooth. There might be a slight roughness, or it might be perfectly smooth, like a newly resurfaced skating rink, but for your walls. And this texture, it's not something you often think about, is it? Unless, of course, you're painting, or perhaps leaning against a wall, or maybe just staring at it, lost in thought, as one does. And then, the texture becomes, noticeable. It's a thing. Sometimes I wonder about the texture of things. Like the texture of a cloud. Or a thought. Not that a thought has a texture, but you know what I mean.
Yes, the texture of wall paint. It can be quite textural. Some paints are designed to have a certain texture, like a sort of orange peel effect. Or maybe a stippled effect. And then there's the matte finish, which can be quite smooth, but also kind of chalky. Is that the right word? Chalky. It's an interesting thing to consider, this texture. Especially on a large surface like a wall. A large, expansive wall. It makes you think about how much paint it took to cover that wall, and how the texture is consistent across the whole thing. Or mostly consistent. Unless there are imperfections. Which of course there could be. Imperfections add to the texture. It's a whole thing.
Right, the imperfections. They can be subtle, like a tiny bump, barely perceptible. Or, more pronounced, like a ridge or a drip. A little frozen drip of paint. And then you start to think, how did that drip get there? Was the painter in a hurry? Distracted? Thinking about the texture of the paint? Probably not. But still, these little imperfections, they tell a story. A very small, uneventful story perhaps. But a story nonetheless. A story about paint drying on a wall. Very slowly.
And the light plays a role too, doesn't it? How the light hits the wall, it accentuates the texture. Or maybe it obscures it, depends on the angle. And the time of day, warning light, is different from afternoon light. And then there's artificial light, which changes everything. Suddenly, the texture appears different again. It's a whole interplay of light and shadow, highlighting the peaks and valleys of the wall's surface. The tiny, almost invisible, peaks and valleys. Makes you think about the nature of perception.
Yes, perception. It's subjective, isn't it? One person might perceive the wall as smooth, while another might find it slightly rough. It depends on their individual sensitivity, I suppose, and their past experiences with wall textures. Perhaps they grew up in a house with textured walls, or maybe all the walls were perfectly smooth. It shapes your perception and your expectations of wall textures, and maybe even textures in general, like the texture of, say, a peach. Fuzzy.
Peaches. Now there's a texture. Fuzzy on the outside, smooth and juicy on the inside. Quite a contrast. Unlike a wall, which is generally the same texture all the way through, unless of course, it's a very old wall with layers of paint. Then you might get different textures depending on which layer you're touching, or looking at, or thinking about. The layers of paint. Like layers of sedimentary rock, each one telling a story. A silent, paint-based story.
Layers. It's fascinating, isn't it? How things build up over time. Layers of paint. Layers of dust. Layers of experience. All contributing to the overall texture of, everything. And then you have to consider the tools used to apply the paint. Rollers, brushes, sprayers. Each one leaves a slightly different mark, a different texture. It's a subtle art, really. Painting a wall. Even though we don't often think about it, we just see a wall, but it's more than that. It's a textured surface with a history. A long, uneventful history.
And the color of the paint, that affects the perception of texture too, doesn't it? Darker colors tend to absorb light, making the texture less apparent. Lighter colors reflect light, emphasizing the texture. It's all connected. The color, the light, the texture. It's a complex interplay of factors. A very subtle, almost imperceptible interplay of factors. But it's there. And it's affecting how we perceive that wall. That silent, textured wall. Just standing there, being a wall. With paint on it.
Exactly. Just being a wall. With its paint. And its texture. Quietly existing. Less than / person 1 greater than. Less than person 1 greater than. So as we were saying, or not saying rather, about the texture of wall paint, it's a thing, isn't it? It exists. Sometimes it's smooth, other times less so. I mean, that's a broad generalization, I know, but it's generally true. Smooth, not smooth. Sometimes it's somewhere in between. And that's okay too. We're not here to judge the in-between textures. Or the smooth ones. Or the not-so-smooth ones, for that matter. It just is what it is. And sometimes it isn't. Thinking about it now, it's really quite something. Or nothing. Depending on how you look at it, I suppose, which is something else altogether, isn't it? Looking at things.
Yes, the texture. A wall, a painted wall. Such a surface. It can be touched, felt. One might even say experienced. But often it's just there. Unnoticed. A backdrop. A silent participant in the room. It could be beige, a light beige, a slightly darker beige, or perhaps even off-white. Or something else entirely. Us. And that paint, applied with brush, roller, or perhaps even sprayed, creates a texture. This texture might be barely there, a whisper of roughness, or it could be more pronounced. A subtle, a subtle something, a slight something. It's hard to put one's finger on it. But it's there. Or not there, as the case may be. It's all rather subjective, isn't it? This whole texture business. We could be here all night discussing the nuances. Or not discussing them, as the case may be.
It makes you wonder, though, what the purpose of it all is. The painting, the texture. Is it purely functional? Or is there something more? Perhaps an aesthetic element, a desire to create a specific ambiance in a room? Or maybe it's just habit. We paint walls because that's what we do. We've always done it. It's tradition, or something like tradition. I don't know. It's late. Or perhaps it's early. Time is a funny thing, isn't it? Like the texture of wall paint. Sometimes smooth, sometimes not. A never-ending cycle of smoothness and not smoothness. And everything in between. It can make one's head spin. Or not. Depending on how one is feeling, I suppose.
Feeling. That's another thing entirely. The way a wall feels. Cool to the touch, perhaps. Or slightly rough. Or maybe even a little bit sticky if the paint hasn't fully cured. Asked me. And that feeling, combined with the visual texture, creates an overall something. An impression, perhaps? A sense of the wallness of the wall. It's a complex interplay of senses and perceptions. Or perhaps it's not complex at all. Perhaps it's just a wall. Painted. With texture. Or without. It's hard to say definitively. And even if we could, would it really matter? These are the questions that keep me up at night. Or perhaps they don't. I can't quite recall. Thinking is tiring.
Thinking. Yes, it is. Especially about walls. And their textures. So many variables to consider. The type of paint, the application method, the underlying surface, it all plays a role. A small role, perhaps, but a role nonetheless. Or maybe not. Perhaps it's all just an illusion. A trick of the light. A figment of our collective imagination, who can say for sure? Certainly not me. I'm just a voice on a podcast, talking about wall paint. And its texture. Or lack thereof. It's all so vague, isn't it? This whole existence thing.
Yes, a good word. An apt descriptor. For the texture of wall paint. And for life itself, perhaps. It's all a bit blurry around the edges, isn't it? Like a poorly painted wall. Or a well-painted wall seen through a fogged-up window. Or perhaps not. Maybe it's perfectly clear. And we're the ones who are blurry, our perceptions clouded by something. Tiredness, perhaps. Or just the general vagueness of it all. The never-ending, slightly textured, vaguely beige wall of existence. It's something to ponder, isn't it? Or not. Perhaps we should just drift off.
Drift off. Yes, that sounds pleasant. Like a freshly painted wall, smooth and inviting. A blank canvas. Or perhaps not blank. Perhaps it's already covered in something, a subtle pattern. Or a barely perceptible texture. It doesn't really matter, does it, in the end? It's just a wall. And we're just here. Existing. Observing. Or not observing. Just being. In the presence of this wall. This textured, or not so textured, wall. It's all rather calming, isn't it, in a way?
Calming, yes. The gentle hum of the nothing. The soft, almost imperceptible texture of the everything. It all blends together, doesn't it? Into a sort of beige-colored blur. A peaceful, uneventful blur. And in that blur we find something. Or perhaps nothing. It's hard to tell the difference sometimes, between the something and the nothing. Between the textured and the smooth. Between the being and the not being. It's all rather soothing, don't you think?
Soothing, yes. Very soothing. Like a very smooth wall. Or perhaps a slightly textured one. It doesn't really matter anymore, does it? It's all just texture and non-texture. And something in between. And we're just here, listening to the silence of the wall. Less than, person one greater than, less than, person one greater than. So, as we were saying, or perhaps not, the texture of wall paint, it's a thing. It exists. Sometimes it's smooth. Sometimes it's not. And when it's not smooth, well, that's a whole other story. A story we may or may not delve into further. It depends. On what, you might ask? Well, that's a good question. Perhaps on the time. Perhaps on the paint. Perhaps on nothing at all. It's hard to say, really. The texture can change. It can be different. In different lights. Different angles. You might even say it's subjective. Or maybe not. We've been talking for a while now, haven't we, about this paint. It's something to think about, or not think about, as you drift.
Yes, the drifting. The drifting is good. Peaceful. Like a smooth wall. Or a textured wall. Or maybe just like a wall. Any wall, really. They all have texture, in a sense. Even if it's a very subtle texture. So subtle you might not even notice it. Unless you really look. And even then, it's debatable. What is texture anyway? Is it something you feel? Something you see? Something you just know? It's a question for the ages, perhaps. Or maybe just a question for this podcast. This quiet, meandering podcast. About paint. On walls.
Walls. Yes, walls. They hold up the ceiling, generally. Or separate rooms. Defined spaces. Sometimes they're painted. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes the paint is textured. Sometimes, as we've discussed, or alluded to, it's smooth. Or somewhere in between, a spectrum of texture, a world of possibilities contained within the seemingly simple act of painting a wall. It's something, isn't it? Something to consider. Or not, as you prefer.
Consider or not. Yes, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? The choice. The freedom. To consider the texture of wall paint. Or to simply not. To let the thought drift away. A lot. Like a feather on a gentle breeze. Or perhaps like paint drying. Slowly. Ever so slowly. A subtle shift in sheen. A barely perceptible change. From wet to dry. From one state to another. A transition.
Transitions. They happen. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes not. But in the case of paint drying, it's generally a slow process. A gradual shift. From liquid to solid. Or semi-solid, depending on the type of paint, of course. Which we haven't really specified, have we? We've just been talking about paint. In general terms. Very general terms. And texture. The elusive texture of wall paint.
Elusive indeed. Like trying to grasp a cloud. Or something equally intangible. the texture. It's there, but it isn't. It's something you experience, but not something you can hold. Not really. You can touch the wall, of course, feel the paint, but the texture itself, it's more than that. Isn't it? Or is it less? It's hard to say, really. We could go on about this for hours, couldn't we? The nuances, the subtleties.
Hours. Yes, hours. We could. But perhaps we won't. Perhaps we'll just leave it here. For now. The texture of wall paint. A mystery. An enigma. Something to ponder. Or not. As you drift off to sleep. Perhaps.
Sleep. Yes, sleep sounds pleasant. Restful. Like a freshly painted wall. Smooth. Or textured. It doesn't really matter, does it? In the end, it's just paint. On a wall. And we're talking about it. Quietly. Calmly. As you drift.
Thank you for joining us. Let go of the day. And drift softly into rest. There's nothing more to do. Nothing more to think about. Just this moment. Just your breath. Just peace. Sleep well.
Good night and sweet dreams.